I grew up with Luke Skywalker. The very first film I saw in the theater was A New Hope, which we just called Star Wars in those more innocent times. It was, in fact, one of my very first memories. I was 5 years old, and I remember sitting next to my mom in the theater, watching Luke fly his X-Wing into the trench of the Death Star. And I remember one shot particularly where we saw what he saw from his cockpit. The walls of the trench whizzing by amazingly fast and far too close for comfort. George Lucas gave me a way to see through the eyes of his hero in that moment. And that's a point of view that was continually expanded when my friends and I would get together to play Star Wars in our backyards. And we would all pretend to be our favorites. I had one friend who had a thing for Boba Fett, and this was long before Boba had ever actually done anything. One was Darth Vader. But me, I was always Luke. With a discarded broomstick painted light blue in my hands, roaming the galaxy at one with the Force. He was my first hero of legend, my first archetype, although, of course, I couldn't articulate that then. I watched him leave his home, face his trials, defeat his shadow, and save his father. And I saw him transformed into this legendary figure that he was destined to become. And then Luke went away for a while, for about 30 years. To be exact, besides a brief cameo as a newborn. But when he came back in 2015, I was pleased to meet him on more even ground, because you see, Luke Skywalker came back as a mentor while I was walking the path of one myself. Now, in the interim, I had become interested in comparative mythology and become an English teacher as well. And I had seen that any quest like Luke's is not about finding a literal grail or destroying an evil ring or even about saving the galaxy. It's always about growth, creative growth, spiritual growth, the triumph of selflessness over selfishness, about the attainment of wisdom. Mythologist Joseph Campbell called such a quest a heroic journey. And he said it was akin to walking a path through a darkened wood, one that must ultimately be walked alone. First, the hero needs a guide, a mentor to show the hero where the path might lie, where the pits and traps may be. Maybe provide a map or a talisman somewhere along the way. And Campbell also said this. He said that the ultimate aim of the quest must be neither release nor ecstasy for oneself, but the wisdom and the power to serve others. Now, the final phase in this heroic journey is a return phase. And the essence of this is that the hero brings that wisdom and knowledge back home to share with those who need it. They share the grail. They bring the grail back. They don't hoard it for themselves. Now, to me, that sounds an awful lot like a task for a mentor. So perhaps mentorship is the ultimate task of the hero. And we're always in need of mentors to serve the next generation of heroes. And I think that many people want to be mentors, but they're not quite sure where to start. I know that 20 years ago when I started teaching, I wasn't sure either. But a lot of the lessons that I needed to know, I learned through story. There's a lot to be said for the mentor of old, for Virgil and Merlin, all those dusty old wizards of yore. But they tended to be decidedly one note. They were authoritarian, kind of oracular know-it-alls. The modern mentor is a little more dynamic, a little more human, a little more fallible. And if we look at these characters, whether you call them mentors or role models or teachers, or what Campbell called them, sword masters, which is just an awesome title that I'm going to demand my students start to call me in class. And we look at the stories that they are drawn from, we can find ancient advice converted to more modern language. Now, I don't mean to imply that the only way to become a mentor is to become a teacher. Not at all. In fact, sometimes it gets in the way. All you need is a desire to share whatever your path has shown to you, not some degree or certification saying that you're a board-licensed mentor. So what can these stories tell us about what it is to be a mentor? Well, these are some lessons that I have learned and I'm still learning from the fictional mentors that have guided me along my own path. It is, to be sure, a highly personalized list, but I do think that there are some universal lessons that potential mentors can glean from this. Share our passions. Think about every mentor you've ever had. Which ones are the most memorable? Chances are at least one or two of them had a great deal of passion for the subject that they taught. Now, most teacher inspires students type of stories feature this type of mentor. So I'm going to go with Dead Poets Society's John Keating, my captain, who might be a very large reason as to why I'm a literature teacher. Now, if there's a mystery ingredient to this stew, and I'm not saying that there is, it might be this. Mr. Keating is invested in his passion for literature. And philosopher Alan Watts said that interesting people are interested. And I prefer to add invested to that as well, because Mr. Keating is all three. He is invested in his passion for literature. And as a result, his students are invested in their own passion for literature and in creativity and then in their search for the truth. Passion is infectious, and it can be conveyed in 1,000 different ways, but its presence is undeniable. Know when to step aside. Now, this is a tough one for me because I like to think that I'm important. But there comes a time in any mentorship when it's the mentor's task to stop talking and step aside. Over the course of 7 novels, we watch Albus Dumbledore grow farther and farther away from his pupil, Harry Potter, much to Harry's rising concern. But this is by design. See, the old wizard knows that he's dying and that Harry must very soon stand on his own. It is a tenet of mentorship that every now and then our students need room to experiment, to create, destroy, succeed, fail, all on their own without the influence of the mentor. We should want our students to transcend us, not to join us. We are what they grow beyond. That is the true burden of all masters. This is my old friend Luke's last lesson from the ghost of his mentor, Yoda. At some point, our paths and our pupils' paths are going to diverge. Invariably. It must happen. And our task is to prepare our students for that moment by encouraging them to find their own way to blaze their own trail and find their own truths, not just retread the ones that we have shown to them. Authenticity. Lead by honest and genuine example and not solely by virtue of instruction. I recently reread Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, a novel that I hadn't read since college, and I became reacquainted with a mentor that I had almost forgotten about. Vasudeva is a ferryman, great metaphor for a mentor, by the way, who is Siddhartha's ultimate mentor in the novel. He is described as old and childlike at the same time. He is honest, forthright, simple, and is never anything except what he is. We don't need anything special to be a mentor. We just need to be ourselves. Now, sometimes authenticity is as simple as saying, I don't know. Sometimes it's about being compassionate. But it's always about representing ourselves genuinely, flaws and all. Admit our failures. Even the greatest mentors have flaws. We are human after all. Consider To Kill a Mockingbird's Atticus Finch, who just might be the greatest mentor of all time. Watch out, Merlin. Yet even Atticus fails in his defense of the innocent Tom Robinson, while his children look on, horrified. But that failure is, in fact, the lesson being taught as our heroes, Scout and Jem, learn a pretty horrible truth about the town that they call home. We live in a culture that dreads failure. But growth does not happen in stagnancy. Growth requires the presence of risk. And when failure is a part of the lesson being taught, that should be dealt with directly and forthrightly. Obi-Wan Kenobi felt responsible for Luke's father, a former pupil of his, turning to evil. And this is something that he concealed from Luke for as long as he could, for his own reasons. As a possible consequence, when Luke is faced with the same situation and loses one of his students to darkness, his nephew, in fact, he responds by sending himself into exile, by cutting himself off from those who need him the most. Not a very mentor-like reaction. And I've often wondered what Luke's mentoring situation would have been like if Obi-Wan had been truthful with him about his father's fate from the outset. Advocate and connect. It is often the task of a mentor to advocate for their pupil. In The Hobbit, Gandalf the Grey is often a staunch advocate for that novel's protagonist, Bilbo Baggins. Most often, Gandalf is an advocate for Bilbo to Bilbo himself. You see, Bilbo is occasionally plagued with self-doubt about his value and worth. And it's Gandalf's job every now and then to step in and remind Bilbo about those things as he walks his path. Sometimes as heroes, we place obstacles in our own path as we travel. And when that happens, it's often the mentor's job to point at those obstacles and say, wait, look at what you did there. But to do all of these things, we must know our students. That's something that all the mentors on this list have in common. There's more and more pressure in the teaching business to be guided by statistics, data. But after 20 years of teaching, I can honestly say that knowing a student's test scores and reading levels is vastly inferior to knowing that they're tired today, to hearing them tell me that they liked the movie I recommended to them last week, to knowing that their grandma is in the hospital, to hearing that they finally understood that lesson I taught them 10 years ago, really, to knowing that they are frustrated, frightened, or hungry. Along the steps of my own path, I have played many roles. I have worn many different mantles, and to paraphrase E.B. White, not all of them have been a good fit. But the role of a mentor is one that I feel fits me well, and it is something that without which my own journey would be incomplete, like a partially drawn circle. But for all these fictional mentors that I've talked about today, Obi-Wan and Gandalf and all the rest, it was a very real mentor that led me to all them. My mom. The person who sat beside me all those years ago in 1977. Her passion for myth and literature led me to this very moment right now. This is her legacy. And all these ideas and connections and stories came from her, the way that leaves will someday come from an acorn. All these stories and characters are shadows. Meaningful, relevant shadows, yes, but shadows, nevertheless. We're the real thing. You, me, my mom, every mentor you've ever had. We're the ones who give these stories and characters purpose. And right now, someone out there needs a mentor. They need you. Regardless of your age or experience. And if you decide to accept that call to mentorship, it may just so happen that you find, as I have, that oftentimes the most valuable lessons are not handed from mentor to pupil, but rather from pupil to mentor. Oh, I'm sorry, I mean to say, from pupil to sword master.